Why do people not agree on whether it is tolerable for a hungry child to steal food or not? Why do people not agree on the famous moral question of whether it is tolerable for a man to steal medicine for his sickly and dying wife or not? And just generally speaking, why are so many people divided on religion and politics when otherwise they would be ordinary and good moral people?
We have people that are stupid.
Johnathan Haidt, who is a moral psychologist by training, asks himself exactly these questions, and his book, The Righteous Mind, is his attempt to actually answer them. So the Righteous Mind is divided into 3 parts, and each part is a principle for his conception of moral psychology. Those principles being 1, intuition comes first, strategic reasoning comes second. 2, morality is more than just harm and fairness. And 3, morality binds and blinds.
Nice.
What those principles briefly characterize is that firstly, for intuitions come first, strategic reasoning comes second, is the idea that we have a response to the world, and then we use our reason to justify our response to the world, or justify our feelings towards something. That's what principle 1 is about. Principle 2 is more about what is called weird morality, which stands for Western, educated, individualistic, democratic, and wealthy societies. Their kind of morality has become to be seen as foundational or dominant morality, but he argues that it's not. And then the last one has to do with group psychology and how our morals bind us to groups and blind us to the morals of other groups. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we will explore one chapter from each one of those sections so you can get an understanding of what his worldview is. So under the section, intuition comes first, strategic reasoning comes second, we have the first chapter, which is, where does morality come from? Haidt answers this question in 3 different ways, or in other words, there are 3 worldviews that can attempt to answer that question. The first worldview to answer that question is nativism. Yeah, it's nativism, which is the idea that basically moral knowledge or moral ability, but generally speaking, humans' abilities, are predetermined and hardwired. We were given to them by nature. They are native to the person. That is the idea behind nativism. The second one is empiricism. And when Haidt uses the word empiricism in the book, he means environmentalism. Environmentalism being the idea that moral knowledge, or human ability, generally speaking, is acquired through experience and learning. And then the last worldview that Haidt mentions is rationalism. And the idea behind rationalism is that children learn morality on their own, but on top of that, they have to learn it at a certain stage or a certain period in their life. They have to have the right hardware, right? So the idea would be that you can't teach a giraffe calculus because it's missing the hardware, but you can teach a human calculus because it has the right hardware. And the same thing would hold true that you might not be able to teach a 4-year-old, let's say, the nature of volume, right? If you put water in the chubby cup and you put it in the skinny cup, it's going to retain the volume because it has the same overall volume. But once they reach, say, age 5, then you can teach the kid, well, actually no, the kid will teach themselves through experimentation and reasoning that, oh, look, the volume is the same in both cups. Now, Haidt himself falls into the rationalist camp, but not all rationalists are alike. There is a massive amount of variation between the rationalists, and he spends a lot of time in this chapter going over those different worldviews. In the rationalist camp, we have Piaget, very famous writer. We have Kohlberg, and we have someone else whose name is Turiel. These 3 are basically major figures in moral psychology that have been debating about the nature of rationalism and morality for probably 30 or 40 years. Piaget's general idea about morality in humans was that children learn their own moral rules through play and action. Kids on the playground will interact with one another and they will learn moral rules that get them outcomes that they prefer. Of course, Kohlberg then follows up to that and disagrees, and he points to case examples of children at certain ages following rules blindly. Kohlberg actually argues that after a certain age, children no longer follow authority for authority's sake, and they begin to think in different ways. He actually says that moral development occurs in stages. The first being pre-conventional, the second being conventional, and the last being post-conventional. Now, this is where Turiel comes into the picture, and Turiel says that children never follow authority for authority's sake, or they seldom do. And Turiel provides studies where children actually engage in disobedience towards figures of authority if the consequent of obedience was harm towards another child or harm towards another person. And Turiel then argues that children don't think in terms of conventional and unconventional morality or post-conventional morality. They instead think in terms of harm and care. However, at some point in Haidt's graduate research, when I think he was doing it in moral psychology as graduate research, he came to the realization that many of these moral psychologists were focused on harm and fairness or harm and care, and things like respect or authority or sanctity weren't really considered moral notions or anything that moral judgments could be made about, which he thought was quite odd. In his experience, he's witnessed cultures that have morals around food, morals around clothing, even morals around how to act in public. And none of these have anything to do with actually harming another person. A lot of the time, it's just an insult to the greater society or to the norms at the time. But that doesn't make them any less moral to the person who believes in them. Maybe in Western societies, we don't think that that's a moral thing because nobody got harmed. But in other societies, they seem to have the genuine belief that it is a moral bad. And Haidt brings up a great quote from, I believe it is a cultural anthropologist or cultural psychologist, I'm not sure. But the quote is, "The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational, and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively both against other such wholes and against its social and natural background, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures." What Schroeder is in effect saying here is the famous thing that you see in philosophy, that there is an Eastern and a Western way of thinking, and that what you'll see on the Eastern way of thinking is people are not so individualistic, they're more sociocentric, as Schroeder puts it, and in the Western hemisphere, people are individualistic. And he says that the societies are like this as well, not just the individuals, that in some societies you have a sociocentric society, and in other societies you have an individualistic society. And what Haidt concludes from this, and how you get to understand his worldview about rationalism, is morality is in some sense learned. If you have a sociocentric and an individualistic thing, and there are no biological differences, at least not substantially different, differences between these groups of people, then their individualism and their sociocentric outlooks have to be learned. They're environmental factors. And of course, Haidt would also argue that there is some degree of hardwiredness to them. But for the most part, we are learning these things. Now, the next section is there is more to morality than harm and fairness or harm and care. And the chapter I'm going to talk about here is the moral foundations of politics, which is pretty self-explanatory. The idea in this chapter is, what are the moral foundations of politics? He starts off this chapter with a little bit of metaphysics or like philosophy of psychology, although he might not admit to this, that these are presuppositions. But this is kind of what he's doing. He's building the axioms for his framework. And he says that the self-interest model of human nature is wrong. The idea that people only pursue their own self-interest or their rational interest is matter-of-factly wrong, and he cites some famous cognitive science, heuristic studies, and so on and so forth, where people don't actually pursue what is their self-interest, like behavioral economics, yada, yada, yada. And then he also says that his moral foundations theory is pre-wired into human nature. Now, besides disagreeing with the idea that the self-interest model is wrong, I don't want to get bogged down in that. Let's explore what his moral foundations theories actually are. So the moral foundations theory comes into 5 broad categories. So the first category is care/harm. It's the one that has been most explored in the Western world. And he argues that this originally came about because we need to care and protect children, but that its modern function in current times is not the same as simply caring for children. It has a greater scope now. A great example of this is the famous expression that you hear all the time in Western politics, is that the wealthy don't pay their fair share of taxes, or the people who are on public benefits don't commit their fair share of the workload. On top of that, you have things like harm. If it doesn't harm anybody, we should allow them to do it, right? This is kind of the famous utilitarian worldview, where as long as someone's doing something that doesn't impede another person or harm another person, then it's fine. It is not an immoral thing to do. That's kind of the general scope of our modern harm/care or harm/fairness category. The next one is loyalty/betrayal. And interestingly enough, Haidt has this idea about multi-level selection, and that these moral foundations can be viewed as frequency-dependent traits that can confer advantages for reproduction. And loyalty/betrayal would be one of them, because if you think about humans, we're social animals, and in groups, we have to punish those who betray us, and we have to reward those who are loyal to us, which kind of sounds very similar to morality. Reward and punishment can be words that can be interchanged with morals, such as good and bad. Now, what is interesting about the loyalty-betrayal one is he says liberals are more universalist, and so they don't really score high in this category. They prefer to care about everybody, and you can see this actually to make sense of the current issue with the Ukraine funding, is liberals are more universal, more inclusive, and so they'll fund anybody who is being harmed, right? Liberals score really high in the harm/care category. When other countries being harmed, we're universal, we support them. And for conservatives, it's loyalty, and it's very not universal. They're very high in loyalty, which is why they're very, the idea about like troops being hurt or troops being loyal to the country should be taken care of. This is why conservatives have a lot of talking points around this issue. And it also explains the kind of reversal that people have pointed out, which is that people have said conservatives were the war hawks, and now all of a sudden the liberals have become the war hawks. But for Haidt, nothing new has changed, because again, the liberals are just caring about people globally, and they're being harmed. They don't like that. They want to stop the harm. And conservatives are only caring about themselves or their group, which is not a bad thing necessarily. The next one is authority/subversion. And this has to do a lot with obedience to, say, law or God, or to a figure of authority. In some cultures, respect to the elders is a must, and to not give respect to your elders is a moral harm. The great example could be young Japanese researchers having issues with critiquing more published and respected and eldered researchers, and as a result, they can't really question mainstream ideas. But on top of this, you also have societies that have a high respect for God, and if you disobey anything that comes from God, it is a moral bad. Even if you don't harm anybody, it's just a moral bad to disobey God. And then those who score high on the subversion part of that authority subversion category, think about rebellions or rebels, the French Revolution, any leaders that become too, let's say, overbearing or immoral, or any cultures that become oppressive. What you'll have is people who score high on subversion coming about and subverting the oppressive or restrictive culture. Now, the last category is sanctity/degradation, and it can basically be said purity and disgust. It can also be called purity and disgust. This is the last foundation, and this sounds exactly like what you would think it is. So, for example, introducing alcohol into your body is a moral bad because it introduces impurities. Or stepping on a flag, you can't step on a sacred object like a flag. That is a moral harm. Anything that is violating your notion of sacredness is a moral bad. And then things that are intrinsically bad are things that are disgusting. So for example, he gave the thought experiment of, if you spit in a cup, and we ask you to drink it, you will not drink the spit because it is disgusting. You have this kind of automatic disgust response. And even though the cup can be sterilized and it's still just your spit, so it's the equivalent of you swallowing, people won't do it. This is kind of the idea of purity and disgust. Now, the last section is morality binds and blinds, and I don't think there is a single chapter that really gets to what he was talking about in this section of the book because it's so varied. He starts off with one chapter talking about group selection and how group selection has been kind of thrown to the sidelines in evolutionary theory, or evolutionary theorizing, and he thinks that that's wrong. He does think that there is a utility to considering group selection because he argues, for instance, that evolution occurs on multiple layers. Right? Some people argue that the phenotypic, like your hands, arms, are the only level that evolution occurs at. Other people argue that it only occurs at the level of the cell. It's called neural Darwinism, where cells compete for natural resources and the ones that get them reproduce. He thinks it's a multi-level selection, and one of these levels of selection is at the level of the group, by which he means that if there are certain groups that have one of his moral foundations being higher, that group might have a better advantage in a given environment. The great one that I mentioned earlier is loyalty and betrayal. If you score high on loyalty and betrayal, then you will have a similar ethic to another group of people, and you're more likely to cooperate with those groups of people and therefore get better access to resources, so on and so forth. Which means his moral foundation theory is kind of an argument for group selection, or at least that's what he's trying to do. Now, he also says that in addition to us, let's say, preferring to hang out with other people who score high on loyalty and betrayal, we have this other thing where we're blind to the morals of other people. The best experiment I can think of to characterize this was one that he didn't mention, but what happened in this experiment was they took two conditions. They put a university student in a room with other university students doing exams. And let's say it was like Harvard and, I don't know, Princeton, okay? Let's say they put a Harvard student in a Harvard jacket in a Princeton exam room. When they took the exam, they had the Harvard student cheat. Now, during this student's cheating, the other students would report the Harvard student. All the Princeton students would report the Harvard student. Now, do the same exact experiment, except this person who's going to deliberately cheat now has a Princeton jacket on. So they're in Princeton with a Princeton jacket. The students will not report the other students cheating. And so the idea here is that the in-groupness, or you belonging to a particular group, can completely revoke any kind of rational morals you have. And on top of that, it goes back to what Haidt said in the beginning, which is that intuition's first, strategic reasoning second. So that is the overall gist of The Righteous Mind by Johnathan Haidt. It's actually a fairly good book, and to be honest, I didn't need to take too many notes because he's a clear writer. And when the writer is really clear, you don't need to memorize things because it was put in such simple language. Who should read this? I think everybody should read this. This is a great book to read. It was very fun, and the ideas in here are actually quite important. And the question I walked away with, which I wish Haidt would have answered, was, what are you leaving for ethics? Because he even cites a study in here where they looked at, for example, which field steals the most books from the library? And it was ethics. The number of books that were missing in the ethics category was much higher, like significantly higher than every other category. And so even like professionally trained ethicists weren't more moral. And it seemed like Haidt was saying that morals, like ethics, is relegated to like a sideline, and what matters more is like the behavioral like relationships people form with objects, kind of like the behaviorist approach, or like the conditioning they experience. Or it seems like what Haidt is actually saying is that ethicists are just basically good justifiers, but their moral intuitions, they're not like more nuanced at getting moral intuitions. They're just better at like justifying why they have the moral intuitions. Yeah, it would have been interesting for him to explore on that. That's the only critique I have of this book. Other than that, this book is like a 9 out of 10 or like an 8 out of 10, and I highly recommend you read it. That being said, guys, if you've read this book, let me know what you think. I know it's a popular book and you probably have at least heard of it. I'd love to know what you think about this book, but bye-bye for now.